Hello everyone and welcome to our class on ceramics in archaeology. So the reading that I asked you guys to do today was this article by Prudence Rice called On the Origins of Pottery, which I think touches on a lot of the issues we discussed earlier. So it's, I think, a good start to a class on ceramics because for those of you who got through the article, you saw it was both a discussion of the earliest ceramics that we see in human prehistory, and at the same time, it's also a literature review of the scholarship that's asked this question, sort of the research that's been done on the earliest pottery over time. And so this is sort of an example of how you go about studying a subject, in addition to data collection, which is something that we talked about last time. Another thing that you need to include in any research project is sort of the background history of that data collection or of that sort of subject that you're proposing to study. So one of the things that we need to consider when we start thinking about the earliest ceramics, and this is sort of what the article begins with, is sort of the matter of identification and dating, right? When do we actually see what we might call ceramics or fired clay, pottery or vessels? And when do we actually see these happening in human history or human prehistory? Another thing that we need to consider, in addition to sort of where and when these things start showing up, is why this happens, right? Why do we see the emergence of ceramic production in human society? Why does this need or desire for fired clay containers actually arise in human groups? And here's what we need to remember is that ceramics are actually an independent invention in multiple locations. So it's not an idea that one group comes up with and just sort of spreads around the world from there, that multiple groups are sort of coming up with this idea of creating pottery. And it's still kind of a question for us as archaeologists, why this happens actually. There are some societies that don't produce ceramics, but there are very few. So it's one of those things that's sort of ubiquitous in most societies, which is why ceramic analysis is actually sort of a large field in archaeology. So Rice sort of talks about three intersecting domains of knowledge as sort of these factors or conditions that lead to the emergence of ceramics in society. The first is the idea of clay, right? That you would have this malleable sort of substance that you could get from the earth. And we sort of see this knowledge in human society emerging quite early, as early as, the Upper Paleolithic, which is probably about 20, 30,000 years ago or so, where we find, small figures and tokens, both unfired and fired, right? Little tiny objects that have been made out of this substance. The second domain of knowledge is this idea of fire, which we sort of know human groups have had knowledge of very early. And in some cases, there is some association with these fired clay objects that I just mentioned. And I think they give an example of the Saidolni Vestonici, but even really earlier than the Upper Paleolithic. And here's when we're starting to talk in terms of human evolution. We have knowledge of fire amongst many human groups. And then the third, and I guess sort of to me kind of interesting um, domain of knowledge that Rice talks about is this idea of containment. And here you also have to consider the idea that containers can be made out of other types of material rather than clay. And then there's also different ways to think about this idea of containers, right, or vessels. The first is obviously the functional idea, which is probably the first thing that comes to mind, right? The use of containers or these clay vessels to process food or store it for storage purposes, for transportation and serving. But the second sort of and also interesting sort of aspect to consider is the symbolic sort of meaning of various types of vessels and containers, right? That first of all, on the one hand, particularly early on, that certain forms of ceramics or ceramic technology itself might have been considered a prestige sort of technology or prestige object and may have been limited to certain groups. And then also we can think more generally about the different styles and decorations that pottery and ceramics come in, and sort of how that might indicate some sort of symbols or systems of meaning. So while we can think about those three intersecting domains of knowledge, clay, fire, and containment, I think, again, it's important to remember that the earliest fired ceramics, right, fired clay objects that we find are not containers, or not vessels of any form. They're sort of these figurines or small tokens that have sort of been either found in association with the fire or found otherwise. And there actually doesn't seem to be any continuity from these early fired objects with the later sort of clay vessels that we see emerging in later society. And it's another, again, important to note that we probably had containers, other forms of containers made of different types of materials long before ceramic containers emerged, right, out of more perishable materials that we don't know about anymore. But the question really is, when do these three things come together, right? This knowledge of clay, this knowledge of fire, and various forms of control over it, and then this need and sort of desire for containment of various forms. And again, this sort of what you see in this Rice article is a discussion of how these things come together in different early ceramic traditions around the world. So when we start asking questions about the earliest ceramics, there are a few issues that we need to think about. One of the major issues is something that we talked about a little bit earlier, and that is the issue of preservation. Remember, we talked about how non-organic materials tend to preserve better than organic, and extreme climates favor preservation of organic materials a little bit. So when we start talking about ceramics, in terms of ceramics, there's some preservation issues that we need to consider, particularly thinking about how long ago a lot of these early ceramics were made. So a lot of these earliest fired ceramics, or what we call sort of, the fired clay pottery, is relatively low temperature. I mean, what we mean is, in contrast to sort of later periods where there was more control over fire and sort of pottery could be fired at higher temperatures, the earliest fired ceramics are relatively, lower temperatures, and we'll talk sort of a little bit about what that means when you fire clay at different temperatures in a later class. And what that means is that these fired clay ceramics, compared to later ceramics, are relatively, I won't say soft, because it's still sort of a hard, durable material, but they're very porous, and they're a little bit more crumbly. And the main issue to think about, particularly in certain geographic regions, is this type of material, this sort of low temperature fired ceramic, does not really preserve very well in environments where you have, sort of cyclical patterns of freezing and thawing, much like what we have here. So this sort of these early low-fired ceramics is something that Prudence Rice in this article calls a soft ware. And this is sort of, I guess, a play on the fact that a lot of ceramic types we sort of describe as wares. We have like red painted ware and rusted coated painted ware and black and red ware. So ware just becomes sort of this label for types of ceramics. So this sort of stuff, I guess, we could call a soft ware, because it's relatively softer, I guess, or less durable than later higher temperature fired ceramics. So the idea of a horizon is also sort of the layer, sort of the an associated time period where these would occur. Right, so these earliest ceramics form what Prudence Rice is calling here a software horizon, right? This early layer of low-fired, sort of more porous, less durable ceramics that actually only, we may only see in certain environments, because we might not see sort of that early conjuncture of clay, fire, and containment that was identified earlier as sort of the domains of knowledge that lead to the emergence of ceramics, I guess. That we're not going to see this in certain areas where this software horizon might not preserve very well. So I guess sort of in terms of our understanding of preservation, what we know is that in certain environments, like alkaline environments, we do tend to get decent preservation of this type of software, these early low-fired ceramics. And I guess basically the alkalinity or the acidity of the soil base is based on the rates of precipitation that you have in an area compared to the rate of evaporation and or transpiration. So if you have more precipitation, there you have a tendency for acidic soil. But if there's more evaporation, you tend to get a neutral or alkaline pH to your soil. So we find alkaline soils in sort of subhumid environments like on grasslands and prairies, and then in semi-arid and arid climates we also get alkaline soils. So this creates in some ways a bias in preservation when we start thinking about the regional emergence of ceramics. And what we do tend to see is the earliest ceramics that we know about come from these sort of alkaline environments, right? Semi-arid, arid climates, and so on. And so that sort of could lead to questions again about whether we're missing the software horizon in other places. So preservation is definitely something that we need to think about when we think about the earliest ceramics. So another issue that we need to think about is that the earliest ceramics may not have been very abundant, in the sense that they may not be all over the place at early sites. So they might have been fewer in number because some of those early fired ceramics may have had more of a ritual or prestige association, right? So their usage and sort of the space where they were used would have been restricted potentially. So it sort of would have been it might be harder for us to find these sorts of things as archaeologists. And I guess the slide here what you see is sort of showing you, exactly what it's like to try to examine things as an archaeologist, which hopefully you also got a sense of when we talked about survey and excavation. So what you see on the right-hand side is sort of a plan of this site in Israel, and then you can kind of see on the left-hand side an aerial view of the excavated trenches or excavated units that are just really basically just a tiny little fraction of the site when you see how it's represented in this little gray shaded area on the site plan. So, I mean, the idea is that, when we're looking for an object like early ceramics that might have been relatively rare, it's almost like looking for a needle in a haystack. And again, when you think about the process of excavation and how time consuming it is in terms of analyzing all those materials, there's a lot of archaeology. So it's also possible that this sort of needle in a haystack idea is also something that biases our understanding of the earliest ceramics and where they come from and where they're being produced. So keeping these issues of preservation and restricted use in mind, I guess, we can start thinking about where around the world we see archaeological evidence of early ceramic traditions. And we can start with the Old World, by which we mean Asia, Africa, and Europe, which is a place where humans evolved and we've had early groups for hundreds of thousands of years. So when we start talking about developments like agriculture and ceramics and so on, we often, place the earliest developments in the Old World. So we can start with East Asia, which is probably where we see the earliest ceramic traditions. And here we have a lot of questions about where ceramics emerge as an independent invention and where it diffuses or sort of spreads from another area. So the earliest sort of established, I guess, tradition of ceramic production comes from Japan, in fact. And we have an example here, what's known as Jomon pottery. So we have a number of periods where we think we see early ceramics being produced in Japan. The incipient, the initial, the early Jomon periods spans basically about 12,000, 13,000 years to about 4,500 years ago or so. And it's possible that there might also be some pre-incipient pottery, so pottery that predates this 13,000 year sort of span. So this is arguably the earliest ceramic traditions that we see in the world. And you can see they're quite elaborate. They're not simple, crude sort of designs. They're quite sophisticated and quite elaborated in terms of their shape and their design. So another place where we see early ceramics in East Asia is in China. And the conventional view is that here we'll see early ceramics sometime between about 10,000 and 14,000 years ago. Although recently there have been claims that there have been ceramics from much, much earlier, about 20,000 years ago. I think I saw a BBC article about some caves in southern China. And there's also some early dates that have been reported from other parts of East Asia and Japan. And in general, just ceramics seem to spread pretty quickly throughout East Asia once they emerge. So I guess there's some debates about, where it's first emerging and who's learning the traditions from who. But basically, East Asia, whether it's China or Japan, is where we see the earliest ceramic traditions emerge. So when it comes to talking about Western Asia, and here we sort of mean, what we'd call Anatolia, modern day Turkey, Syria, and parts of Iran, we definitely have evidence for the use of non-container fired ceramics, right? Stamps and seals and figurines in very early periods, sort of that software horizon that we mentioned earlier. But when it comes to the earliest pottery vessels, right, ceramic sort of containers, probably the earliest here we would see around the 8th or 9th millennium BCE, so about 10,000 years ago or so. And this is a period of time that we associate with what's called the Neolithic period, which is associated with the earliest farming groups, farming communities. And this is the area that's known as the Fertile Crescent, where the first Neolithic societies or agricultural societies are believed to emerge. But in truth, it's possible that these vessels that we're seeing in Western Asia, at least, are emerging a little bit earlier than this Neolithic period, although there's some debate about sort of the order of the emergence of these different types of technologies in Western Asia. So South Asia is another area that we could consider. It's not covered in the reading, but this is where I work on ceramics, so I figured it's worth sticking in. And actually there has not been a lot of work done on the earliest ceramics in South Asia. The earliest pottery that we talk about is usually associated, again, with the first Neolithic or farming societies that we see in Baluchistan, probably around 6,500, 7,000 years ago. We actually do have earlier settlements that have pre-pottery levels, where we do think there's sedentism or permanent settlement going on, but without ceramic technology. And this is a pattern that we actually see in many places in Western Asia as well, that you have these pre-pottery levels, a sedentary occupation followed by ceramic phases. But one of the problems is sort of interpreting this pattern, particularly in South Asia, is that a lot of this prehistory is based on sort of Western models or patterns that are presupposed or presumed to have existed in the Middle East and Europe in particular, and that's not always as accurate, and that's something that we can sort of examine as we continue looking at data or ceramic data throughout the semester, is sort of the way certain patterns are sometimes interpreted using outdated models. So Africa is another location where we can talk about relatively early pottery. And this is actually in a number of locations across Africa, particularly in North Africa, where we have evidence for relatively early pottery around 9,500, 8,000 years ago, and then also in the southern Sahara region and in the Middle Nile Valley. There's also some differences between different regions and sort of the emergence of ceramics that we see in different parts of Africa. So in areas like the Eastern Sahara, we find early ceramics, but not a lot of them. There's not that many sherds, which is suggesting that maybe in this region ceramics had a more symbolic value or prestige value, rather than having a sort of more utilitarian or functional value where we might find them in greater abundance. And then in contrast to that, when you look at places like the Middle Nile Valley, you find relatively early ceramics in abundance, suggesting that maybe they would have had more widespread use and a more practical function. So that's another thing to think about when you look at the emergence of early traditions like ceramics, is sort of um, the potential difference in meaning across space or in different areas. So Europe is another place where, like in Western Asia, we sort of see this association with early Neolithic farming communities and and ceramics, although the ceramic traditions probably start earlier. So we do have evidence during what's known as the Epi-Paleolithic period. Again, sort of a lot of those fired little figurines and tokens. But in general, what we see is sort of the pattern of Europe follows the pattern of Western Asia and the Middle East, which is where a lot of traditions are diffusing from, actually. So probably after about 6500 BC or so. Um, and actually, these early farming communities, these Neolithic groups, are generally associated with a particular type of ceramic, or they used to be associated with the ceramic type that you see on this slide here, known as the linear band ceramic groups or ceramic types. And you know, what's interesting is when you start talking about Europe and sort of the migration of different groups into Europe and the emergence of technologies like agriculture and pottery, there are a lot of debates about how these different technologies and these systems of knowledge diffuse or spread from the Middle East into Europe, which is the case of many of these things. And in the past, a lot of these arguments were based on sort of the distribution and spread of things like ceramic types, like this linear band ceramic and so on. Additionally, language has been used to study these sorts of migrations, and these days we've been using DNA as well. But this again is sort of an example of the integral role that ceramics can play in sort of talking about big picture questions in archaeology, such as sort of the emergence of different types of technology in Europe and ancient migrations in general. So those were the cases that we can think about in the old world, where where we're seeing the earliest ceramics. And then in addition to that, or perhaps in contrast to that, we can also think about cases in the New World, in the Americas in particular, where, according to archaeological evidence, we believe humans are arriving between about 20,000 and 12,000 years ago. So this sort of timeline brings up a lot of interesting questions about the types of technologies that are being brought from the old world to the new world. And in many cases, particularly when it comes to things like domestication, ceramics, potentially, and many other things, that there's a lot of technologies and processes and developments that are independently invented. So sort of the new world and the old world become interesting sort of case studies to contrast with one another. Um, so thinking about some of the earliest places where we see ceramics in the New World, I guess the earliest evidence comes from South America, and in particular from sort of the eastern tropical regions of Brazil, in particular, sites like Taparinha and Pedra Pintada. And in particular, what we find in a lot of these sites are shell middens, which are these huge sort of trash dumps of marine shellfish, essentially, and there's sort of very distinctive archaeological traces of these things. And we find ceramics within these shell middens, and we've sort of dated those layers to about 8,000 years ago or so. And so that sort of gives us a very early date for ceramics in Brazil, or in South America at least. So when it comes to considering other parts of the Americas, like Central and North America, I guess the idea is, or at least the current interpretation is, that ceramic technology spreads from South America into these other areas. So there's this idea of sort of south to north sequencing going on. So in Central America, we get early dates, probably around 6,000 years ago, in northern Colombia, and then a little bit later in northern Costa Rica, around 3,700 years ago. In Mesoamerica, we have evidence for early ceramics probably on between about 3,800 and 3,600 years ago. And in North America, we have three particular areas where we see ceramic traditions emerging in sort of different cultural traditions in the southeast U.S., the southwest U.S., and in the Midwest. Um, in the southeast, what we find our ceramics are found probably around 4,500 years ago or so in sort of the coastal and riverine areas of Georgia and South Carolina. And then sort of soon after that, we see ceramics being more widely adopted in sort of the Gulf region. In the Southwest, we actually find interesting parallels to sort of the traditions and sort of the patterns seen in Eurasia. So we actually start with the earliest use of ceramics being not vessels, but sort of these unfired figurines and small objects and tokens during what's known as the early Archaic period. And then containers seem to be adopted a little bit later, probably around 400 BC or 150 CE or so. In particular, we see this in southern Arizona, and it's associated with pit houses, a particular style of dwelling, and then sort of this idea of seasonal occupation that people are sort of moving from place to place following sort of a seasonal pattern. And this is, again, sort of a model very similar to what we see in Eurasia. And then when we start considering the Midwest, we see a relatively late adoption of ceramics, not until what's known as the early woodland period, around 700 BC or so. So again, we sort of have this idea of ceramic technology moving from the south to the north. So in many places, what we do have is, I guess, a dependent invention or the diffusion of an outside technology. And it's interesting to think about sort of what leads to the adoption or modification of outside technology in a lot of these groups. So what we sort of see overall in both the old world and the new world is sort of different traditions of independent invention and diffusion or dependent invention in multiple locations. So in addition to these, I guess, multiple locations of independent invention, as well as the, diffusion of this ceramic technology across the world in multiple locations, I think what we should also think about is the time period which this is occurring, which to us may seem like a long span of time, but in terms of geological time or even human history, it was a relatively narrow period between basically 20,000 years ago and 8,000 years ago. And this span of time roughly falls into what we would call the terminal Pleistocene and then the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. So these periods, the Pleistocene, the Holocene, are referring to geological periods in the Earth's history, and they correspond to various climatic shifts and sort of changes in the environment. And what we see actually is during the Pleistocene, which is kind of associated with the period of the evolution of humans, we sort of see some sort of dramatic shifts in climate. When we sort of go between periods when things are very warm and sort of favorable to time periods when it's very cold and much more severe and sort of more severe forms of weather. And then as we move into the Holocene around 13,000, 12,000 years ago or so, things become a little bit more favorable. We stop having these sort of very dramatic fluctuations in climate, and it just tends to warm up a little bit. And again, this sort of transition period and sort of the end of this Pleistocene is when we associate sort of a lot of early human development occurring during this period. So this is the time period when people are moving to different parts of the world, getting to the Americas, beginning to settle down in this process that we call sedentism, when they stop moving around and living a nomadic lifestyle and sort of start living in one place, right, in a permanent settlement. And then also, as we start moving into the Holocene, we start to see the emergence of domestication, right, farming communities, and the domestication of animals as well. And then things like pottery and other associated traditions also start to emerge during this time. So, we want to be careful about making too many links to the environment as sort of the primary cause of these sorts of changes in human society. But certainly there is some sort of factor that we need to consider that's linked to the environment when we think about the emergence of these kinds of social changes and technologies. So when we look at these different case studies of early pottery around the world, the sense is that there are probably many different reasons and ways that pottery emerged in different areas, but overall you can kind of see a few patterns or commonalities um, looking at the entire history. So when we look at the pottery itself in the first place, we can see some commonalities or patterns in the sense of the form. We have similar forms, with early pottery being, wide bowls, deep bowls. We get jars, dishes. They're basically flat base cylinder or rectangular forms, or griddles. They tend to be relatively small with an average diameter between about 15 or 30 centimeters. We get different types of surface treatment on the outside, incising, punctuating when you sort of pressing, making little holes, or impressing designs. The earliest pottery doesn't have a lot of paint or slips, and we'll talk about those as time goes on. Another commonality is a lot of early ceramics seem to be tempered with fibers. So temper is basically something that you include in the clay before you fire it, and that sort of prevents cracking as the clay expands and shrinks during the firing and cooling process. So there's different types of things that you can add as temper, but a lot of the early pottery used organic matter, so things like grass, chaff, or other fibers. And we're not quite sure whether this was always deliberately added or whether this was just something that was in the clay and inadvertently got mixed in. But from experimental studies, we do know that when you put fibers like this, organic materials, into clay as a temper, your clay has what's known as greater green strength, which means before you fire it, it's actually a bit stronger. So the idea would be that if this is a deliberate sort of tempering strategy, this is a good thing for unfired or low-fired ceramics. That again, though, then presents this sort of issue of preservation, which is, we have this software, this stuff that may not preserve very well, or that may only differentially preserve, which is something we can talk about again. And what we're going to see as time goes on, later on, ceramics use mica or other mineral tempers a little bit more, and so that's sort of one general pattern, but again, there's some variation in that as well that we can think about. Another thing that we can think about are patterns in the function of ceramic, and here we can think about all pottery over time, not just the earliest pottery. And there's three general categories of function that we generally think about when we talk about pottery. We can talk about processing, which means things like cooking, or fermenting or extracting oils and things like that. The earliest pottery was actually doesn't have a lot of evidence for sooting. This idea that it would be sitting directly on a fire and be fire blackened, which is evidence that we see with later cooking pots. So it's possible that early pottery during this time, if they were used as cooking vessels, may have been being used by indirect cooking methods, like what's called stone boiling, when you heat up a stone and then you put your vessels on top of that and then sort of cook off of that, basically. It's also possible that we just have sort of a bias in recording strategies and we're not finding evidence of those fire blackened pots. But the advantage of being able to use a vessel to cook your food in, at least according to sort of ethnographic and experimental thought, is the idea that, look, you don't have to tend pots the same way as you would, say, if you're just roasting meat on a spit and you sort of constantly have to be there watching over it. In contrast to that, you can put something in a ceramic container, a pot, sit it on the stove or on this sort of hot stone and sort of tend to it, but sort of not be watching over it constantly. You can also do things like cook shellfish, and again, do other sorts of processing of foods, like, cooking other kinds of plants, fermenting beverages, extracting oils. So that's one function, right? This idea of processing. Another function that we can talk about is the idea of storage. And storage becomes important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it becomes important when your resources are seasonal, right? When they're only available at some times during the year, and so you sort of have to make sure that you're storing enough for the rest of the year. Another time storage becomes an important factor is when your resources are abundant, whether you're collecting it from the wild or growing it yourself, having a surplus or having extra food, right, that isn't required for the immediate needs of your population, requires some form of storage. And here again, ceramics may play some role in that. What's interesting is we have these ideas that some of the first, earliest human groups, these hunting and gathering groups, were making pottery as an accumulative or storage sort of strategy. But actually, while we would expect to see this in higher latitudes where it's colder and we actually don't have, maybe we don't necessarily need preservation the same way, we actually see this in lower latitudes, which again sort of points to the fact that it's always hard to really come up with testable patterns. We talk about archaeology, but this sort of issue leads us to sort of the last sort of function that we sometimes think about when it comes to pottery, and that is the issue of transportation, and not just of food, but any kinds of materials, and then also serving or the distribution of food. And this is where we can start making this leap beyond the idea of just household consumption to the idea of feasting or social storage. And again, we can sort of sometimes question this idea about climates and how that leads to differential patterns of food production and storage. So the idea is often that in warmer climates where spoilage is an issue, you don't necessarily need storage. And so feasting might be a good way to sort of dispose of unstorable surplus in times of abundance. And it's also seen as a way of building up the prestige of an authority of leaders in a society. So there's, again, just all kinds of links that we can make to broader questions that we ask about past societies, looking at various aspects of ceramics, such as their form, their temper, and their function. In addition to the pottery itself, another sort of set of patterns that we can see are in terms of the regional similarities in the emergence of early pottery. So here we can start looking at things like the environment, where often we're finding early pottery in tropical or subtropical areas, or coastal and riverine environments near particular water sources. And this can relate to, I think, ideas of subsistence and the availability of resources, right? This access to water. But again, we always have to sort of consider this issue of preservation. So it's possible that we have very early fiber-tempered pottery from areas of like the Midwest and eastern US, but that these were destroyed by those freezing thawing cycles that occur in these types of environments, right? So we also have to consider this idea of what happens to low-fired and highly porous early ceramics. Another problem that we may have looking at coastal sites is that because coastlines change with the rise and fall of sea levels, is that a lot of these early sites that we might be talking about are probably submerged at this point. And again, we can also think about just sort of the differential preservation of this software, of these low-fired ceramics that are more likely to preserve in alkaline soils rather than acidic soils. So dry soils are also more alkaline, so we would probably expect to find more low-fired ceramics, in these sort of semi-arid, arid climates. And what's interesting, though, is that we don't see a lot of evidence here. We see these evidence for early ceramics in what are called riparian environments, which are more acidic, right? These water areas that are close to water sources, with the exception of what are known as shell mounds, which I mentioned earlier, which tend to create alkaline environments, which could be one reason why we find ceramics in association with these shell middens that we talked about before. Another sort of trend in terms of regional similarities that we could talk about is the low latitude where a lot of these things are found. Again, we're talking about tropical and subtropical climates, which brings up similar issues about preservation and resource availability that we just talked about earlier. In these areas, what you see is that there's more environmental diversity, but there's less seasonal variation. Right, so sort of the resources that are available are sort of tend to be available year round, and you don't sort of have sort of a lot of fluctuation between seasons the way you do in other parts of the world. Another thing that we can think about in terms of regional trends are patterns of subsistence, or sort of patterns of in the way that people acquire their food, which is what we refer to as subsistence. So generally what we see, and again there's a lot of variation here, is that these early ceramics are being produced in pre-agricultural societies, societies that are not yet dependent or sort of even possibly having knowledge of farming and sort of domesticating plants and also animals. So this is what we'd call the late Paleolithic, or sometimes in parts of the world Mesolithic phase, in a lot of different areas. And again, this is sort of geologically, in terms of sort of human geological periods, sort of what is known as the Pleistocene Holocene transition, sort of the several thousand years that sort of span that change, that we sort of mark as the Pleistocene period, and then the Holocene period. And this, again, during this time, what we see is not the advent of domestication and farming, but rather intensification in the hunting and gathering practices that people were already doing. So we see sort of more advanced techniques in hunting and fishing and just basic gathering strategies. And earlier, this is sort of a change from earlier assumptions that sort of linked the emergence of pottery to what's known as the Neolithic Revolution, right? The sort of advent of domestication, which radically transformed society in a lot of ways. And there was sort of this equation that people are coming up with, the idea of domestication, the sedentary lifestyle of living in one place year round, and sort of pottery was all sort of part of one big package. And now looking at the evidence, we sort of see that maybe a lot of these things are independent phenomena that occur in different orders, but there are some patterns that we see worldwide. So one thing that we again are sort of seeing is that these early ceramics are not associated with sedentary societies, which is earlier what we had sort of assumed or believed was sort of the pattern or trajectory of development. Um, so we don't have a lot of evidence of permanent year-round sedentary occupation when ceramics are emerging, but people also aren't just randomly roaming around the landscape. There is some evidence for what we would call restricted mobility or semi-sedentary settlement. So people are possibly living at a number of seasonal camps or sort of moving around and shifting from place to place, but there is a sense that mobility is not as free ranging as it once was, once people start producing things like pottery. And we still have to do a lot more paleoclimatic research and sort of studies on seasonality in different regions to sort of understand how this might have played out better. Because really, when we talk about this transition between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, we're talking about, thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. So this is a very long period of transition. A lot of developments occurring at a lot of different paces are going on around the world. Another thing to think about is that a lot of these interpretations, or many of the interpretations that we're coming up with to sort of explain and describe the emergence of early pottery, are based less on the archaeological record itself and more on what's known as the ethnographic record, right? The observation of living groups that allows us to make inferences or assumptions about how things were done in the past. So the evidence that we often look to talk about the emergence of early pottery is looking at sort of nomadic and transhuman and semi-sedentary groups in the present day and the ways that they make and use pottery. And there are some limits to this sort of ethno-archaeological work, and we'll talk about that, but that's another thing to keep in mind when we start thinking about sort of our understanding of the emergence of early pottery. So we can see a lot of, or some similarities and patterns in the emergence of pottery around the world, but an important question to keep in mind is sort of how much of this pattern is due to preservation issues, right? That's something we definitely have to consider. What's also important to consider, and perhaps the most difficult question to actually conclusively answer, is why all of this happens, right? Why do we see the emergence of pottery over time? And this is a much more complicated question than where pottery emerges for the first time, or when pottery emerges for the first time. So Rice starts out with some of the earliest theories, and we can continue to sort of thinking about them. I guess some of the earliest theories, she starts off talking about, 16th century Europe and how people saw ancient pottery remains as dwarf utensils. But really, there's, archaeologists have come up with a number of other, I don't call them formal theories, but ideas about why people decide to start producing these vessels or these sort of containers of fired clay. So the first is what's known as the architectural hypothesis, that just sort of looks at parallels between the construction of buildings of clay, what's known as mud brick architecture, that we particularly sort of see for, I won't say the first time, but very early on in the Zagros Mountains, around 7000 BC or so. And the idea is that this link between fire and clay is made from sort of this technical knowledge of plaster production that's used to construct architecture in early society. And it's true in Western Asia, some of the earliest pottery is made from plaster. But because we no longer have this link between pottery and sedentism, we know that pottery actually emerges with mobile semi-sedentary groups before people start building, permanent settlements out of mud brick. This theory might seem a little bit difficult to sustain these days. So we've also got what's known as the culinary hypothesis, which is probably the most widespread or accepted theory about why pottery emerges in human society. And I guess this is just, again, the idea that it's a lot easier to cook food. You can sort of expand the range of things that you can eat as food once you're able to start cooking it. And again, we may have had other containers before ceramics, and there's potentially lots of different ways that this connection between fired clay ceramics and using them as vessels could have been made over time. So we have a lot of evidence that early fire pits were lined with clay, which may have sort of given people the sense of how clay hardens with fire. And we actually find a lot of early ceramic vessels are shaped like other containers, so they could be sort of in the shape of gourds or baskets, and sometimes you even find the impressions of these things, so they could have been used as press molds. We also find evidence, and people even do this these days, of clay cooking methods, when you may actually wrap meats or fish in the clay itself and sort of roast it that way. So that could be one way that this idea of creating, sort of a clay cooking vessel emerged. And a lot of these sorts of theories that are linked to cuisine and sort of cooking practices, again, are sort of linked to this assumption that pottery is sort of associated with that Neolithic transition, that move in society towards food production and agricultural strategies. And it's possible that this is what's happening in some places, but it's sort of, again, reflecting sort of Western-centric sort of ideas about the evolution of civilization, and this sort of association with the cultivation of particular grains and cereals that require processing. So things like wheat and barley and corn. So pottery is actually something that's integral to the cooking of these grains, but you can only do it when you have a sedentary existence. You can't grow these crops when you're sort of living a semi-sedentary or nomadic existence. But again, remember, we're seeing the emergence of pottery prior to practices of domestication in a lot of different areas. In fact, pottery is associated with these complex hunting and gathering strategies. And even earlier to that, during like the Upper Paleolithic, we see sort of this non-vessel use of baked clay. So again, sort of this link to the Neolithic Revolution may not necessarily be one that we can really support, but there is something, this idea of food production, right, and food preparation. And similarly, we have another theory that sort of talks about resource intensification being sort of one of the reasons why people start producing pottery. And again, this has to do with the idea that, you know, it has less to do with the range of resources that you can use and more the idea that you can then start storing food, building it up, and then serving it. So there's certain archaeologists that have come up with these ideas that, container technology was really important for ideas of communal display and feasting practices, and sort of leads to the emergence of social political complexity in various ways. Other people sort of say that, look, this, intensification that we see in the use of pottery and various resources has less to do with surplus and extra and these competitive feasting sort of events, and has more to do with protection from scarcity. And this may come out of interpretations of climate changes that we see during the end of the Pleistocene, when there's less predictability and people aren't as sure of their resources. So in some places, people think of, or some views, people would think about pottery being used as a way of benefiting or sort of taking advantage of a resource abundance. And other people might interpret sort of the idea of pottery being something that protected against scarcity because of storage, right? So we also see a lot of other views sort of develop similar to this that come, they're sort of talking about the types of resources that are available and what type of processing you need and so on. But again, when we start looking at these sorts of models, they're often linked to the idea that mobility is declining. And then we start seeing links to the emergence of social differentiation, where individuals are gaining power by controlling social relationships through their control over things like exchanges of materials and control over surplus in feasting events and so on. And that sort of brings us to the last sort of reason why people suggest that, you know, groups have started making pottery in the past, and that looks more to the social or symbolic functions of pottery and less at the more functional aspects like cooking and storage and so on. So here we talk about ceramics and their social or symbolic value. We can think about both, you know, the non-vessel use of ceramics and the non-utilitarian aspects of vessels. So things like decoration and style. Additionally, we can think about context, right? The places where we're finding these things. So remember in the earliest stages, like the Upper Paleolithic, we find things like big figurines and beads and tokens, and we're still trying to interpret what these things meant. And then a lot of early pottery, though we don't have a lot of paints or slips, we do find it very decorated. A lot of early pottery has elaborate surface decorations with impressed or incised designs. Um, and then another thing to think about, and this is some of the, what sort of the paucity of early ceramic evidence suggests, is that, you know, some, in certain places, ceramic production would have been a restricted technology. That maybe it was a prestige item or prestige technology because it was playing some kind of a role in social display or feasting events. And so those are sort of some of the, again, sort of symbolic or non-functional theories. And we talk about these last two theories, sort of like the idea of resource intensification or these symbolic purposes, the emergence of pottery traditions. You know, I guess sort of what that sort of demonstrates is the way that pottery can play a role in sort of asking these bigger picture questions in archaeology about the development of social complexity and hierarchy. And these are sort of some of the major questions that archaeologists do ask, right? Sort of why do we see increasing complexity or increasing inequality in societies over time, and where does that come from? And sort of, you know, what patterns does it take in various regions around the world? Um, so ultimately, you know, we can ask questions about why pottery emerges in so many different parts of the world, and it's probably a combination of different factors. And I think, again, it's important to remember that in different regions, we may have had different scenarios going on. There's no one pattern or one trajectory of development that sort of explains every scenario around the world. And this is, you know, a problem in archaeology sometimes when the models that we develop in one region where we may have a lot of data sort of get picked up and applied indiscriminately to other parts of the world where we may not have a lot of data. And this is something that happens quite frequently where I work in South Asia, where there are a lot of gaps of knowledge in various parts of prehistory just because we haven't done a lot of research there. And people sometimes pick up models that they developed from case studies in Mesoamerica or Mesopotamia or Europe where there's been more research, and they sort of try to apply it to what's going on in South Asia. And the variation just makes this a very inaccurate sort of way to proceed, in my view. So when we start talking about ceramics, as with any other kinds of technology, in human history, you know, there's a lot of different models that are out there that try to explain how and why this technology emerges, but there's no single model that actually explains it in any one part of the world. But when we start asking these kinds of questions, you know, it allows us to start considering some of the general questions that we could think about with early pottery. Like, what are the implications this has for subsistence, right? What kinds of foods can now be processed, eaten, and stored once people begin to develop things like ceramic containers? We can sort of think about the functional value of pottery versus the symbolic importance of pottery. And then we can think about the initial role of pottery as maybe a prestige technology or something that sort of limited to a select few. And this is sort of an interesting way to think about pottery, because these days, at least in archaeology, pottery is really seen as an almost ubiquitous material, with the exception of very few cases. So we don't tend to think of it as a new technology or a rare technology, but at some point it was new and interesting. And I think it's interesting to think about how it may have first been viewed. Um, and another thing we can also think about, and this goes back to that sort of symbolic questioning, is that, and this is a trend we see in archaeology, is that we have this movement away from more materialist, particularly these culinary sorts of explanations for early pottery, and there's much more focus now on the social and symbolic aspects of ceramics. And I think that's just part of a move to ask bigger questions about our ceramic data, rather than just chronology or subsistence or basic issues of form and, in function and so on. That being said, these are still important subjects, so we'll talk about that in future classes as well. So basically, this is sort of a good background, I think, to understanding the types of questions that we can ask about pottery, beginning with where the earliest pottery comes from. And again, when you're doing any sort of research project, this is often the first step, is sort of to explore the history of your topic, with the very beginnings of it. And we'll sort of pick up with this discussion next class. So the next class, I'm going to ask you to read another literature review, basically, which is a chapter from a book about ceramic analysis. And this has more to do with the examination of ceramics by archaeologists. So it's sort of picking up where this discussion leaves off. So email me if you have any questions about that reading, but it is available on D2L, and I will hopefully see you next class.